the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and it brings together a variety of research centers, trade unions, industrial museums, and labor archives, I guess, mainly. And so many of you I recognize, either our team members or have been coming out to a lot of these. And so this is going to be a 7-year conversation, for us, and of course, be doing original research and so on. Today, aujourd'hui, on va faire la deuxième moitié de notre table ronde sur les nouvelles perspectives sur la désindustrialisation. This is the second part of our roundtable on new scholarship, and I think it says something for a field when you have 17 new books and special issues in a field, which is quite remarkable, I think. I think it speaks to the growing sense of centrality of the issues we're dealing with. I think for a long time, these issues were peripheral to how we think about our political moment or our history. But with Brexit and the rise of right-wing populism and et cetera, people are starting to raise questions around class and the relationship between class and gender and race. And so I think that scholarship is more pressing and urgent, and so it's great that we're seeing this wave of scholarship, which I think will continue into the future years. I know there's a lot of new scholars coming up. Even within our project, we have 25, already we have 25 student affiliates who are working mainly on PhD theses, on deindustrialization. So you can imagine, just how much more work is going on and how deep we can go. I already mentioned, I think, just before I started, that the fall we have a roundtable series that's going to be focusing mainly on globalizing deindustrialization, with a panel on the Global South in partnership with a couple other great partners, other projects. Also a full panel on Australia, because there's a lot going on there. And so again, trying to make these connections to other conversations, right, that are happening outside of Europe and North America. So today we have is it 8 or 7 presentations, each for 7 minutes. So our format is very tight, but it gives you a taste of what their work's about. And we've asked them to sort of speak a little bit to their book, and also like what its contribution is, right, to our wider rethinking of deindustrialization and its politics. So we're going to start with Giacomo Botta, who received his PhD in comparative studies in 2003 from the IULM University Milano, and he is an adjunct professor in urban studies at the University of Helsinki and in music research at the University of Tampere. He published widely about urban cultures, music, cities, placemaking, and nighttime economy and urban branding. He is the author of De-Industrialization and Popular Music, Punk and Post-Punk in Manchester, Dusseldorf, Torino, and Tampere, which was published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2020. So go ahead.
Thank you. So I will share my slides. So thank you very much to the whole depot and to Stephen in particular for inviting me here. I'm very happy, and it is the first time I present something in front of the industrialization people for real. So this is quite exciting for me. So the book is a qualitative study of the industrialization and music in Manchester, Dusseldorf, Torino, and Tampere. I think I don't need to introduce Manchester to you, nor Dusseldorf. Well, Dusseldorf is at the bottom of the Ruhrgebiet, which is like one of the densest industrial areas of Europe. Torino is the one company town of Fiat, car company, and Tampere, probably the least known of them all, is in Finland, and it's famous and it's very important in Finland for like textile and paper industry. It has been in the past, so to say. And it's funny because Tampere has a couple of nicknames in Finnish, and one of them is Manse, which is like a Finnishized shortening of Manchester, and the other one is Tampester, which is more obvious. But so my first point in the book was looking at industrial cities, these 4 industrial cities during the late 70s, early 80s, where basically punk and post-punk, I define post-punk very widely, but like a lot of music which came after punk. So we're sort of shaping new forms of making and consuming music. And my questions were like, why there? Why in these industrial cities, which are normally out of our popular music geography? And why right then, at that point where the industrialization was basically turning these cities into cities of crisis, of shrinking, and of decay? So very important for me is to think in terms of sound. So was sound simply a result, simply a consequence of what was a structural economic change? Germans call it the Strukturwandel. Was it just a reflection of certain spatial circumstances, so that decay, shrinking brought this sound to be? And in my book, I try to make sense about this in a different way. I say, no, it's not just a consequence, a result. Basically, sound was actively shaping and mediating the shift, the shift from an industrial city to whatever comes next, post-industrial future, and so on. But at the same time, music was sort of vanished in the process, which doesn't mean it disappeared, but its function changed completely when the sort of post-industrial project became the new paradigm, always like in brackets. But of course, to do this, I start a bit further away, and I try to build a genealogy which makes industrial city and a certain kind of music something which has a long history, which goes back to the industrial folk songs in Lancashire and so on. But I make one example here of a sort of climax of it connected to Detroit and to, the Motown label, where you could see this kind of pride and the idea of the motor city and of material production. There is like a video made for TV of Martha Reeves and the Vandellas lip syncing to Nowhere to Run, one of their most famous single, like through the plant in Baton Rouge of like Ford Mustang. And it's quite interesting. So in many ways, I think both music and industrial production were sort of showing a kind of industriousness. They were both sort of articulating what I call an industrial structure of feeling. So it's not that like music was a consequence. Music was participating into this sort of industrial, until 1960s, you can call it upswing, so to say. And this changed with deindustrialization. And I have examples from these all 4 cities where you see basically sound changing, and you see the end of this kind of how can you call it, this kind of synergy between music, industrial production, and the whole sense of the industrial city. I have some audio example. I don't know if I have time to share them. Where basically you can hear that music is turning into something very different, and you see this energy finishing. Here now, in a second, you hear some screeching noises now, and I found out that like this very bad noises were basically provided by disposed data cassettes, which were used in electric typewriting machine. And therefore, they were sort of making the new model of silent factory. They were making it, turning it into noise. So on one hand, this band was called Mittagspause, so lunch break. So very much, working class kind of name, imaginary, the lunch break. But at the same time, they were experimenting with sounds which were more or less sounds of the future. They were sort of anticipating robotization, precarization, and so on. And then you have pictures like this. This is Joy Division rehearsing in clearly an industrial space, an empty industrial space. So there's also this other element. They were taking over industrial spaces and sort of anticipating what were going to be their future functions within culture, creativity, or whatever. And it's a very nice picture that I like, because the band here is working. They're not performing in front of an audience. They are there. They are working with their head down. So it's quite interesting. Basically, my idea is this: that like music during the industrialization was playing partly with material production as the paradigm of the industrial city, and partly they were already developing something connected to the symbolic consumption of the same spaces for and in name of the post-industrial city. And why I say that music was mediating, first of all, well, because I try to make sense of the fact that you can find elements of both, of the industrial past and of some kind of possible future. And why I say it was vanishing, because this very important to me function basically was lost and is lost. So nowadays you find my interest for writing this book came in 2008 with the economic crisis, where a lot of journalists started saying, oh my God, we're having a big economic crisis. We're gonna have fantastic music. And my idea that it's that like, no, basically, it doesn't really work like that. It is something which, for me, is very specific to what happened in the late 1970s. And that's it. I guess I finished my 7 minutes. Thank you.
That's perfect. Great timing. Thank you so much. And like super interesting.
Thank you.
Loads of questions already. I'm sure others do. Next up is Chiara Bonfiglioli, who I first met in 2014 at our De-Industrialization conference. She did a bit of time here at Codes. She's a lecturer in gender and women's studies at the University College Cork, Ireland, where she also coordinates the one-year interdisciplinary masters in women's studies. She completed a PhD at the graduate gender program at Utrecht University in 2012, and has held postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Edinburgh, University of Pula, and the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. She is the author of Women and Industry in the Balkans, The Rise and Fall of the Yugoslav Textile Sector, which was published by IB Tauris in 2019. Chiara.
Can you all see my screen?
Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Sorry, I went behind. Start from the beginning. So thank you so much, Stephen. The conference in 2014 was a great inspiration for this book, which is now also published in paperback. And it combines gender history, labor history, social history, post-socialist studies, and post-Yugoslav studies. And it's basically trying to overcome this prism of nationalism and ethnicity, which had been at the core of the study of the former Yugoslavia for quite a while, as we know. And it's also tried to expand the field of the industrialization studies to the Balkans by applying the idea of the industrial and post-industrial structure of feeling to the former Yugoslavia. So there are a number of fieldwork sites that I looked at during my research, and there were different sites. So I mainly used oral history interviews in the book, over 60 of them. They were mainly collected in Croatia, but also in other post-Yugoslav states, notably Slovenia, Serbia, North Macedonia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I also combined this oral history interviews with archives and press material and visual material, notably workplace periodicals that were used during the socialist period in a number of factories in the region. And when we think of textile factories in the socialist period, we have to think of them as a site of gender transformations. And I write in the book that everybody I know from the region, so friends, acquaintances, colleagues, they all have a female relative who used to work in a textile factory. So textile factories were really widespread, especially in small cities and peripheral towns, and they were seen as a chief mean of emancipation for rural women who were entering the labor force for the first time after World War II. And they were also envisaged as kind of welfare centers. So they combined production and the sphere of production with canteens, health clinics, leisure facilities, subsidized housing, holiday resorts. So they were seen as this kind of socialist microcosms. And in these factories, there was this very specific structure of feeling that was characterized by different elements. There was an element of self-management, the idea that factories were social property. So they were not state property, they were the property of their workers. And the workers, they had to manage the factory collectively. And also the trade unions had a specific role. They were in charge of welfare redistribution. So there was a certain paternalistic discourse there during socialist times. And another important discourse was the one of progress and sacrifice for future generations. So, and that also tied with gender roles. So women were particularly suitable for this discourse because they were already sacrificing in the home, and then they were asked to sacrifice as well in these factories, which were often employing very let's say, intensive production methods, notably a piece rate work. So a number of these women were employed, and many of them actually were doing piece rate work, and they were doing also night shifts in these factories. And so there was a very strenuous working life there, but there was also certain predictability and security of daily life, including welfare arrangements for working mothers and single mothers, and women who needed a bit more of a buffer when it came to the combination of productive and reproductive life. And so a number of these textile factories were seen as second homes. So most of the women I talked to, they talked about these factories about a kind of a big family or a second home. These were constant elements that came up in the interviews. And this all came to an end with the collapse of Yugoslavia and the end of the federation, but also the end of the Yugoslav market, which was a kind of important market for internal textile production. And also what came to an end was exports to places like the Soviet Union or other places in the global south that were linked to Yugoslavia through the non-aligned movement. And so this all created challenges for the local production. And there was also additional global competition coming from Southeast Asia, as we know. And also it's important to mention in this phase of transition, there were criminal privatization processes linked to the dispossession of working class people during post-socialist transition. So there was an overall phenomenon of de-development, as it has been called. And only in the textile industry, there were around 400,000 jobs lost, of which 100,000 in Croatia, which is the region, the state I studied most closely. And the workers came to experience after the industrialization, not just the closure of formerly successful factories, but also overexploitation in the new private firms that were set up. And they started to feel that they were working not for themselves or for the collective, but for someone else's profit. The trade unions became very weak also because they were not equipped to fight for workers' rights. They were very much on the side of the state during socialism. And so a certain widespread discourse of nostalgia came up, especially this nostalgia for past welfare and working conditions, not so much for the former socialist regime. And workers and former workers and current workers in the textile industry, they worry about precarity, uncertainty, they feel exploited, and they also feel this loss of sociability and community feelings. And somehow the Yugoslav times became a model of normal life and modernity. So especially in places like Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the war also contributed to destroy the economy and the industry that was there once. There was an overwhelming feeling of loss and devaluation after factory closures. And especially because of this discourse of self-sacrifice and sacrifice for the future generation, it became very hard for the workers to accept that this once successful factories were now abandoned and useless somehow. So one woman, for instance, she said, now the factory is so abandoned, so pillaged, so destroyed, that it is terrible and ugly to tell our children and grandchildren that we once worked there. So there is this feeling of really losing like the mother of like a big mother or a big family that was kind of sustaining the local community also in terms of economic development and social development. There was also a lot of resilience. This is a picture of a cooperative that was set up in Zagreb by some of the former workers of the Kamensko factory, who also underwent a hunger strike in 2010. So in one of the chapters, I'm looking at the ways in which new initiatives, cultural and artistic initiatives are connecting with worker struggles and are kind of trying to give voice to worker struggles. And so on the one hand, there is this widespread nostalgia for welfare socialism as a consequence of the current neo-capitalist system, which is also sort of reflexive nostalgia, which is not a critical, but again, is mobilizing the industrial structural feeling of the past. And so former and current workers' resilience and past memories are used as a source of pride, dignity, and identity. And on the other hand, alongside of this, there are also different ways in which workers are exercising their resilience by trying to survive on a day-to-day basis, but also trying to have some sort of organizations or new cultural centers where they can resist the current state of affairs. And again, I think that the lens of social history, labor history, and gender history is crucial to understand the region, the post-Yugoslav region, and to complicate the ethnicity and nation prism. And so this, I would say, is just a gist of the book, of course, in this short time. I hope I didn't go too long. Thank you so much.
Well, that's just great. And again, I think with these two first presentations, they're also taking, inviting us to go beyond sort of like steel, auto, and mining, which tend to be the center of the discussion on deindustrialization. And to think about, like with Chiara's piece, like, geographically, like what's the different contexts and how that changes the meaning of deindustrialization. So this phrase that you use, privatization as dispossession of working class people, to me was very, very powerful. And again, putting gender really central, which I think too is often, often lacking. Next up, la prochaine personne, c'est Pascal Raggi, qui est un professeur à l'Université de Lorraine en France. There'll be simultaneous translation for those who don't speak French. Il est un chercheur à le Centre de recherche universitaire Lorraine d'Histoire et le directeur scientifique de le Musée de l'Histoire de Fer. Pascal spent his childhood and youth in the mining and steelmaking region, and he's the grandson of two iron miners and the son of a former accountant of Lormine, the last French company that operated the iron mines of Lorraine. He is the author of La désindustrialisation de la Lorraine de Fer, which originates in his habilitation in France, which I was lucky enough to be on the committee for, which was published by Classique Garnier en 2019. Pascal.
Merci. Vous m'entendez bien? Oui, ça va?
Oh oui.
Alors, réaliser l'histoire de la désindustrialisation de la Lorraine du Fer, c'est étudier un monde perdu. En fait, moi, mon livre va, comme l'a dit Steven, de 1963 à 2013. La Lorraine du Fer, c'est cet espace. Donc, c'est un espace qui fait 100 000 hectares du nord au sud de la Lorraine. Il y a une petite carte en bas à gauche pour situer la région en France. Et c'est un bassin industriel qui s'est développé grâce au procédé de déphosphoration Thomas Gilchrist de 1877. À partir de là, il y a eu un grand développement industriel dans cette région. Même les guerres mondiales, la première et la deuxième, n'ont pas détruit l'industrie. Et c'est pour ça que sur la carte, on voit une petite frontière en vert qui est l'ancienne frontière franco-allemande. Après la réintégration des provinces qui avaient été prises par l'Allemagne, on a un ensemble qui est situé sur la carte en orange. Au début des années 1960, dans cet espace, il y a 20 000 personnes qui travaillent dans les mines de fer et environ 100 000 dans les installations sidérurgiques. Alors évidemment, vous avez une image de ce que c'est dans la région, la disparition des usines, c'est un peu pareil. Tous les gens qui connaissent la désindustrialisation, c'est à peu près le même résultat. Dans mon étude, je parle du Luxembourg et du Grand-Duché de Luxembourg et de la Lorraine. Ici, je parlerai uniquement de la Lorraine. Première chose, je vais évoquer mon positionnement historiographique. Alors en fait, les difficultés vécues par les mineurs de fer et les sidérurgistes m'ont entraîné à décrire une période historique qui parle de l'évolution des métiers sidérurgiques et des métiers miniers en tant qu'élément d'une centralité du travail qui a été mise à mal par la désindustrialisation. Du côté français, j'ai utilisé les travaux de gens très différents, le sociologue Jean-Luc Dey, le sociologue Stéphane Béot, le sociologue Michel Pialou, le géographe Christophe Guilly, et puis des gens qu'on connaît bien ici, Marion Fontaine et Xavier Vignat. J'ai aussi lu pour cet ouvrage ceux que je considère comme étant des chercheurs pionniers, alors les Américains, Bluestone Harrison, Cowie, les Britanniques, Basin et Shellwall, MacIvor, qui m'écoute aujourd'hui, Tim, Strangelman, les Canadiens, MacKinnon, et puis aussi des chercheurs français qui avaient travaillé là-dessus. J'ai utilisé des archives classiques et puis aussi des témoignages. La bibliographie pour le livre, elle utilise des choses qui sont plus larges que les travaux historiques, puisque en France, en 2018, il y a eu le prix Goncourt qui a été donné à Nicolas Mathieu, qui est un auteur qui a travaillé sur l'imaginaire de la désindustrialisation. Dans ma deuxième partie, je vais parler des mines de fer. Donc, jusque dans les années 60, ces mines de fer sont très performantes. Et puis, il y a une grande grève en 1963 qui va inaugurer un cycle, et on le voit sur le schéma, de diminution des effectifs. À la fin des années 70, on a bien une diminution des effectifs, une poursuite de la modernisation. Et en fait, ce qui est intéressant, et c'est ce que j'essaye de montrer dans le livre, c'est que les mines de fer continuent de fermer, mais les performances des mineurs de fer sont de plus en plus importantes. Par exemple, on sort 147 tonnes par poste de minerai de fer en 1980, et 12 ans plus tard, au début des années 1990, un mineur tout seul arrive à sortir 200 tonnes par poste. La dernière mine française fermera en 1997, et c'était une mine qui était exploitée par une entreprise luxembourgeoise. Cette évolution qu'on trouve dans les mines de fer, on la retrouve aussi dans la sidérurgie française, avec les transformations de la sidérurgie, qui sera ma troisième et dernière partie. On voit bien sur le graphique qu'il y a une baisse importante dans les années 1963-1973, mais en fait, la baisse la plus importante, elle arrive de 1974 à 1985. On a une crise européenne de la sidérurgie avec des luttes des différents sidérurgistes et puis un recul de la proportion d'ouvriers. Et on le voit sur le schéma, en 1989, il se produit quelque chose d'intéressant puisque les effectifs de la sidérurgie française comportent plus de cadres, d'ingénieurs et d'employés que d'ouvriers. Donc, il y a un retournement de situation et cette industrie change. Dans les années 1990, cette évolution continue. Là, j'ai une comparaison avec le Luxembourg. Et on a aujourd'hui, en Lorraine, à peu près autant de sidérurgistes qu'au Grand-Duché Luxembourg, c'est-à-dire 4000. En France, il y a eu des fermetures emblématiques, un peu comme dans d'autres pays d'Amérique du Nord et d'Europe de l'Ouest, le site de Gandrange, le site de Florange, je n'en parlerai pas ici parce que je n'ai pas le temps, mais ce sont des fermetures emblématiques où il y a eu des combats importants du côté des ouvriers. Les métiers aussi ont beaucoup évolué et c'est aussi le sens de mon travail. Et en fait, pour paraphraser le philosophe Bernard Stiegler, pour les travailleurs des aciéries et des hauts fourneaux, il n'y a pas eu de remplacement des métiers par des emplois parce que ces métiers qui continuent d'exister, ce sont des métiers qui sont liés à la création. Donc, il y a une création. Ce n'est pas le bullshit jobs, comme on dit, c'est vraiment un vrai travail intéressant, mais le nombre diminue. Et la production, on voit sur ces chiffres, la production par tête continue d'augmenter. C'est-à-dire qu'on a perdu beaucoup d'emplois, on le voit sur le schéma, mais en même temps, vous avez une productivité qui est très importante et qui est aussi quelque chose qui est lié à la désindustrialisation. Alors, en France, on a eu des dispositifs sociaux pour accompagner les sidérurgistes qui perdent leur emploi. On a mis des gens en pré-retraite, on a créé un congé formation. Et puis, cette évolution, elle a un peu changé à partir de la privatisation de la sidérurgie française en 1995. Elle avait été nationalisée en 1982. Et cette industrie a été de moins en moins prise en compte par l'État et les services de l'État. C'est seulement à partir de, et tout à l'heure Giacomo évoquait la crise de 2008, c'est seulement après la crise de 2008, quand en 2012-2013, ArcelorMittal avait beaucoup de difficultés, que l'État a eu une vraie stratégie industrielle, et c'est seulement à ce moment-là. Et on a mis en place une réflexion pour les entreprises sidérurgiques. En conclusion, j'ai essayé d'être rapide aujourd'hui, pas comme la dernière fois. En fait, cette région, après avoir été l'emblème d'une forme d'industrialisation qu'on a trouvée dans d'autres régions du monde, elle est devenue en France le symbole de la désindustrialisation, parce qu'on a arrêté l'exploitation du minerai de fer, parce que les effectifs de la sidérurgie ont été fortement contractés, et puis parce qu'on a aussi un rétrécissement de l'emprise des usines et des endroits industriels. Et donc, on a une impression de désindustrialisation. Et en plus, la Lorraine est devenue un espace où le secteur tertiaire est très important. Dans la région, et ça, j'en ai pas parlé dans mon livre, mais j'en parle ici, on a eu d'autres grandes industries aussi. Je pense ici au textile et à l'exploitation du charbon, qui ont connu à peu près les mêmes évolutions. Le textile existe encore et le charbon a fermé en 2004. Et pour rejoindre un peu ce que disait Chiara tout à l'heure, de nombreux descendants aujourd'hui des travailleurs des mines et des usines, comme ceux qui continuent de travailler dans les usines, à mon sens, partagent ensemble une culture et une identité qui ont été façonnées par la grande industrie. Voilà, je vous remercie beaucoup.
Yeah, perfect. No, and I think Pascal's work really reflects like the sort of the renewed, the renewed focus on sort of political economy and thinking about sort of economic history, business history, labor history together, and thinking about that industrial region. And again, his study really, again, like the wider study really looks at Luxembourg and Lorraine as a single region, you know, which of course is close to my heart with, you know, the Rust Belt in North America doing much the same. So merci bien, Pascal. Le prochain, c'est Lachlan MacKinnon. Lachlan is a Canada Research Chair in Post-Industrial Communities at Cape Breton University in Nova Scotia, Canada. His recent book, Closing Sysco, Industrial Decline in Atlantic Canada's Steel City, which was published by the University of Toronto Press in 2020, uses oral history to explore the intersections of political economy, bodily health, and environmental changes wrought by deindustrialization. He's also a former PhD student of mine, which I'm very, very proud of. So sorry, Lachlan, I had to add that. So Lachlan, to you.
All right, bonjour à tous. Thanks everybody for coming today. I'm happy to see everybody here from Depot and all of the other interested faces. Here, I'll share my screen. You see this? Yes. All right. So the book that I'm here to discuss is called, as Stephen mentioned, Closing Sysco, and it was published last March. And really, this book looks at the decline of steelmaking in my own hometown of Sydney, Nova Scotia. So growing up in Sydney, the plant had obvious and immediate social ramifications when it closed in 2000. And indeed, my wife's family, 3 generations of her grandfathers, all of her uncles and even her mother worked at the plant at different times, and they were all instrumental in helping to, you know, get me in touch with people for oral history interviews. Her uncle sat in on a number of interviews. They were really kind of key to the whole process of the oral history work, and in kind of getting me connected to the close-knit community of plant workers. Now, in terms of the contributions of Closing Sysco, I think there are really 3 main themes that come through in the book. First, I think I try to root local experiences of deindustrialization here in this part of Canada in national and international contexts of changing political economy related to both regionalism and the specifics of the steel industry. Through oral history testimony, you know, I try to show how working class families respond to these global pressures in different ways at different historical moments. Second, I try to bring issues of the environment and bodily health directly into the conversation. surrounding industrial decline and deindustrialization. And those issues, I think, can't be separated from the broader context of deindustrialization and the conversation regarding cultural invisibility that it brings upon working people and their institutions. And the last main theme, I think, is questions around heritage and memory in deindustrialized spaces. And in these areas, and indeed in Cape Breton, the area I look at, we're able to see how displaced workers try to come to terms with the ruination and spatial dislocation that they've experienced through the invisibility of their former workplaces, right? And how to deal with the spaces that are created by deindustrialization. So before going further, before going further, I'm going to introduce you, I guess, to the place that I'm talking about. The city of Sydney is kind of the main city on this island, Cape Breton Island, which is located in the eastern Canadian province of Nova Scotia. By the end of the 19th century, the northeastern part of the island here, it's shaded on the image you see, had developed a substantial coal industry. And in 1899, in the city of Sydney, the steel plant was opened by a Boston financier. And at the time, it was one of the largest integrated mills in Canada. But when I started writing the book, I think in some ways I started at the end and kind of worked back to the beginning, because I think initially, in my mind at least, the decision to close the plant in 2000 was a question of public policy and the actions of a particular set of politicians who were in power during the time. Indeed, it had been nationalized in 1967 by the provincial government. So when the decision was taken by the provincial government to close the mill in 2000, I saw that as purely kind of a political decision being made by the governing Conservative Party at the time. Although as I continued digging into kind of the political economy of that decision and the history of the plant as a whole, going back even prior to nationalization, I quickly realized that the kind of ultimate causes or roots of this process were based on the structural influences of Canadian and international industrial capitalism in the late 20th century. And in the book's early chapters, I grapple with this question in terms of the context of the Canadian economy as a whole after the Second World War, looking at the factors relating to the mill's nationalization, and then asking why it was unable to keep up with Canadian competitors in other parts of the country, and some of the decisions that were made after nationalization that led to kind of a period of protracted decline. Secondly, I kind of compare that to how the history of the plant is understood locally through oral history. And what we sometimes see is that the political economy of the broader situation doesn't necessarily match how people are experiencing these processes on the ground. And so that's kind of part of the first theme that I look at. Later in the book, looking at the period of the 1970s through the 1990s, two concurrent events, I think, helped build that major focus on the environment and health. First, workers at the mill began lobbying for compensation related to workplace injury, workplace illness and injury due to the exposure to toxic material, especially in the coke ovens. And in addition, community members and nearby residents began agitating during these years for the province and federal governments to take action regarding the emergence of scientific reports detailing high rates of cancer and other illnesses that were, again, caused by exposure to toxic material in the areas surrounding the plant, which is surrounded by homes and streets and so on. Now, as employment numbers dropped as we get towards the end of the 20th century and workers were laid off, issues relating to compensation, health, and the environment quickly emerged into kind of a crisis. These significant issues rooted in the industrial workplace continue to extend long after the plant has been closed. You know, it's that's that half-life of deindustrialization that we so often hear of, or at least it's part of that. And indeed, this image here on your screen is a picture of the infamous human health hazard signs that the government of Canada put up during the 1990s in the area around the plant, just yards away from working class houses that were right next to the plant. So you go into your backyard and you'd see this house, you know, this sign staring back at you, right? And so indeed, by the mid-1990s, the illusion of industrial permanency in Sydney, rather, had been spoiled. The city, instead of being known as kind of the steel center for Atlantic Canada, instead became synonymous with the health and environmental aftermaths of industrial production, home to what became known nationally, at least, as the worst toxic waste site in Canada, the Sydney tar ponds. And recognizing the way that these changes kind of took shape and how they impacted the steelworkers and the community in general, I think provides insight into the way that various types of environmentalisms, working class environmentalisms, middle class environmentalisms, mediated by all sorts of other lenses, intersect with one another under kind of conditions of deindustrialization. And that's kind of the second main theme that I think comes through in the book. In the final sections, and this is an image of the park that now exists on the site of the former steel plant. In the final sections of the book, I think I look at how this history is remembered and represented in the physical landscape and in the heritage landscape that exists surrounding the history of the plant, including a historical film that was made to commemorate the kind of creation of this green space. And what we generally see is that narratives sometimes feature workers' accounts, but they frequently obscure discussions about the necessity of closure or the political decisions and dimensions of that, of that process, never really incorporating these contested ideas into the kind of heritage language that is kind of presented. In each example that we see, what we end up seeing is that the culmination of operations at the plant are kind of treated as part of a broader process where the site kind of returns full circle to a natural landscape, right? This kind of idea of inevitability is kind of baked into the uses of the site after the closure of the mill. And indeed, nowhere do we see really any comment on the long-lasting economic, social, environmental, and health impacts of this entire process of deindustrialization and closure in the year 2000. It's kind of unquestioned. Now, just to conclude, framed within the developing literature on deindustrialization studies, I think that closing Sysco kind of reveals the combined impact of regionalism in Canada, political economy, and working class cultures of resistance on kind of local experiences of industrial decline here in Cape Breton and Nova Scotia. So I think in general, it represents kind of a synthesis of the earlier economic political history of deindustrialization that we saw from the 1980s, Bluestone and Harrison, that kind of thing. And then the cultural and representational approaches that we saw in the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. So in focusing on the relationships and experiences that were engendered through the decline and closure of Sydney Steel, I hope that the book brings some kind of materialist institutional analysis into conversation with the experiential and contingent aspects of class, identity, and place that I think are made clearly visible through the use of oral history. Anyway, and so that's what I think the contribution of the book is. I'll leave it there. Thank you all for coming today.
Thanks so much, Lachlan. And again, I think this is a good example of how a local study does not need to be place bounded, but be place based. And so it's very much engaging with an international scholarship and then thinking through things of political economy on the one side, but also environment and health and so on. Next up, we have Tim Strangleman. Tim is a professor of sociology in the School of Social Policy, Sociology, and Social Research at the University of Kent in Canterbury in the UK. Having worked for 5 years on the London Underground as a signal worker, Tim left the railways in 1988, undertaking a diploma in social science at Ruskin College, Oxford, and then his degree and PhD at the University of Durham. He has researched and written widely on work identity, culture, and meaning, and so on. He is the author of Voices of Guinness, an oral history of the Park Royal Brewery, published by Oxford University Press in 2019, specifically in its oral history series. Tim.
Hi, can everyone see the screen? Great.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks ever so much, and it's a great crowd to be in. So unlike so Stephen's always wanting us to talk about other things than coal and steel. So this is about beer. So the book was published in 2019, and really what I wanted to do was show how deindustrialization was not even the end of a long process of work, imagery, identity, meaning, and construction through the 20th century. And I went through various iterations of a title, and that the title I come up with is a good one, but is forced on me by Oxford University Press. And it comes across as a bit parochial in terms of just talking about one brewery in West London. But what I'm trying to do is tell the story of 20th century work, 21st century work, and deindustrialization. And I'm using Park Royal as what Lucien Goldman called a privileged occasion, or talked about privileged occasion. So there are so many aspects of the brewery's history that sort of speak to particular points about work. Fordism, the paternalism of the long boom, the kind of neoliberal turn in the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s, and then industrial closures and rundowns in the late 20th, early 21st century. So I've talked about privileged occasion, but also without going too new agey, I'm using Park Royal as a kind of idea of it being on ley lines. It's on these, it constantly comes up. If you want to get an example of corporate scandal in the 1980s, Guinness is a really good example. If you want to get a good example of paternalism in the 1950s, then Guinness is a good example, and so on. So I'm trying to tell that story of work and deindustrialization in the 20th and 21st century. And I think it's important that the industrialization studies has to tell the story of work. So, because what I think the industrialization does is reveal, and it reveals some of the kind of taken for granted assumptions we have and the workforce had about work in the day. I'm trying to tell the story of this one site from pre-cradle to post-grave. So in some senses, it's still a work in progress, even though the book's finished. So one of the things that attracted me to the site in 2004, 2005, when I was doing oral histories about closure, was its phenomenal and rich and varied a photographic archive and image archive. And this is an image of the building being built in the 1930s. And then this is the eventual site laid out in huge, very, very rich parkland. And it was a deliberate choice in the 1930s to lay this out as a parkland. I could go in more about that, and that's very important. But the company planted 1,000 trees, 3,000 shrubs, and it really did want to be seen as a good employer and to lay out its grounds as a kind of model factory. Also, there's some very rich and evocative imagery. I know many people have seen this, but taken in the 1940s, 1950s. And I think, again, this speaks to the temper of the time. If you want good examples or excellent examples of a kind of social realist photography of the time, which celebrated in documentary style the worker and the dignity of work, Guinness is a really good example. And there's a real rich catalogue of images like this in the archive. I've included this. This is workers on payday. The pay is being distributed in the back. And then you'll see them each with their quart of Guinness, just about to enjoy their lunch. And they're buying the first copy of the Staff magazine that was created in 1957. Fast forward to the closure and the project I was involved in, and I talk about this in the book, is I was trying to juxtapose the solidity of the work in the long boom with the precariousness of work in the late 20th and early 21st century. So these are women who'd worked in the canteen for 30 years and then their jobs had been outsourced just before closure. And I talked to them about that experience of, knowing and growing up in a company and then having that ripped apart just before closure. Also, work by the end had become very, very precarious. All the work in the up until the 1980s had been done solely by Guinness workers. By the time I was researching there in 2004-05, everything was outsourced apart from absolute core Guinness work. So this is, I think, a Portuguese migrant worker, cleaner. And when I asked to have an interview with the woman, the manager at Guinness had been very helpful, just said, why do you want to interview her? She's not a Guinness worker. And it says something profound about the shift in the value of work, who gets to count as a worker. So this is a kind of family portrait of one shift. Once there'd been 1,500 people on site in the brewery. At the end, this would have been the typical core Guinness work at any one time, to the point where at the end they could fit all the names of the Guinness staff on the back of a bottle of the commemorative brew that was brewed to celebrate the demise of the bar. The books also dwells on the destruction and the debates about the value of the architecture. The buildings had been designed by Giles Gilbert Scott, the famous architect, who also did Liverpool Cathedral and Modern, what's now Tate Modern. And it was a kind of cause célèbre of, because of the way it was and wasn't listed. So I'm interested in that whole story, and again, it propels Guinness onto a national stage. And the demolition itself, I used to kind of explore attachment and loss, detachment from work, how that demolition elicits memory and prompts work and its meanings. So I have all those pictures of buildings being constructed and then the buildings being deconstructed and taken down. And again, how this elicits memory, emotion and anger on the part of some of the workforce, by no means all. And obviously the book's based on oral history. This is Terry. Terry had taken photographs in the plant. He worked from 1975 to 1995. So by the time the plant closed, he'd been gone for 10 years. But he went back and took photographs of the buildings being pulled down. And I asked him why, and he said, curiosity, I suppose. Can't help but go back there. You worked there all those years. And it's just funny. I wouldn't go back and see Lancier's, his former workplace, and they did demolish that building. No, it was something about the brewery, the people in it, the camaraderie, all the people you work with. I couldn't help but go back. It's almost a last tribute. So, I make the point that Terry is going up to London from his retirement home in Southampton, outside Southampton, and that's no mean journey. So he goes and photographs buildings being pulled down, and I just think, what is it about work that 10 years after, in a purely Marxist way, what he's going back is trying to capture the site of his alienation. I wouldn't describe that, but some people would possibly. So just to wrap up, so really what I was trying to get at was the complexities of decline and loss and the multitude of feelings about this. This is not a one-dimensional, oh, isn't it sad, or nostalgia. It's far more complicated than that. I think what I'm interested in is what is revealed by deindustrialization, by actual demolition and loss, but also what comes up, what bubbles up, what ghostly hauntings, to use that phrase, are there. What is revealed about the past, about the present, the future hopes and fears. And I have lots of speculation on the part of workers about what their kids are going to do, and how their investment in that building and that brewery shapes how they feel about work now and in the future. And then also, I think it maps the changing relationship to industrial change. Guinness, like many workplaces, had gone through round after round of job loss. And what came really to the fore, the people who were there right at the end couldn't invest anymore in the idea that it was a shame that it was going to close, because they just felt exhausted by some of them being through 4 rounds of reapplying for their jobs. So I'll end that, and thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Tim. Like a really, really great project. And I'm still amazed by the access you got, the ability to actually, be on the factory floor, during the closure and to interview people on site. Very few of us have that opportunity. Next up, we have Elisa Mazar, who completed her PhD at McGill University in the Department of Sociology, where her research focused on casino mega project developments in Ontario's deindustrializing cities. During this time, she was also part of a research team at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, that advised the Massachusetts Gaming Commission on the social and economic impacts of rolling out casinos across the state. Her book, De-Industrialization and Casinos, A Winning Hand, was published by Routledge Press in 2020. And I also served as the external on her PhD, and it's an awesome PhD. It's even more awesome book. So, Elisa.
Thank you, Stephen. So I will share my screen. Here we are, share screen. Okay, and I'll get it into presenter mode in a second. Sorry about that. Here from beginning. All right. Okay, is it all good? All right, great, thank you. Okay, so hi there, everyone, and thank you again, Stephen and team, for having me here today. It's really a delight to hear about all the important work obviously being done on the topic and the interdisciplinary work being done on the topic. So as noted, my book is titled De-Industrialization and Casinos, A Winning Hand, published in late 2020. So more broadly, with deindustrialization, provincial governments in Canada, as well as state governments in the US, have increasingly legalized and expanded the availability of casinos and more generally gambling commerce, hoping to offset the impacts of manufacturing decline. In doing so, the longstanding heavy reliance on manufacturing in many locales has shifted, with casinos, and in particular resort casinos, actually increasingly promoted as a means of economic redevelopment in these cities. So policymakers, with that, continue to promote the development of casinos under the pretext that they will help cope with deindustrialization. They stress how casinos will benefit host communities, particularly through number one, revenue generation, two, economic diversification, so moving more to the service, leisure, tourism sector, and through employment generation. With that, it has proven actually quite compelling, and we have seen quite a surge in casino developments across Canada and the US. I mean, we can go more broadly, but the book is more contained. Since the early 1990s, we've really seen a surge. So in the academic literature, and also there's a big body of gray literature around this topic, there is quite a messy debate as to whether casinos in fact make good on economically benefiting host communities. What does that look like, and for how long? The body of research itself tends to usually be snapshots in one instance of time, not really looking at or empirically demonstrating how the power struggles around the developments themselves in terms of political forces, larger macroeconomic forces, really color, who gets what when a casino is used in a city that is experiencing manufacturing decline or deindustrialization. So this book looks over a 30-year period at a casino development in an auto town experiencing manufacturing decline. So for context, so this is a map of Ontario in yellow, and you'll see Michigan right next door on the left. And you'll see Windsor has a rectangular box around it. So that's my case. And I look at Casino Windsor, again, located in Windsor, Ontario, which is Canada's automotive capital, has its ebbs and flows, but Casino Windsor itself was the first resort casino, in fact, outside of Atlantic City and Las Vegas. Windsor sits about 3 kilometers away from Detroit. And because of that, Windsor has long been seen as a branch plant or a smaller version of the Motor City with a similar dependence on big 3 automakers in this context, meaning GM, Ford, and Chrysler. In the Windsor case, Chrysler is now the most prominent. GM's gone, and Ford is there, but a very small footprint, and it's always very, it's always like they're about to leave. So it's kind of a liminal space. Casino Windsor also represents the first resort casino being used explicitly to attempt to deal with industrial decline. So for context, in the early 1990s, there was the impending signing of NAFTA, so the North American Free Trade Agreement. And in light of this, Windsor's heavy reliance on automotive jobs and good jobs, quote unquote, meaning unionized, right, relatively higher wages, benefits, job security, this created a deep sense of fear in Windsor. And looking across the river at Detroit, you could actually physically see the emptying out of Detroit. So it became a narrative within the community that this fate was fast approaching Windsor too, even though we have very different, we're living in different countries and there's actually different trade agreements going on and different historical contexts to consider. But it was we were concerned that a similar fate was fast approaching in the early 1990s. So in light of that, Windsor began looking to diversify its economy quite actively into the service sector, and a casino was floated as an idea. So in 1993, the same year NAFTA was signed, the Ontario provincial government signed the Ontario Casino Corporation Act, and this allowed for the establishment of casinos in Ontario, and with a working class government in power called the New Democratic Party, and Windsor being a base that provides a lot of votes for the NDP quite consistently, Windsor was chosen as the first pilot site in Ontario. So this book then looks at the lobbying efforts surrounding casino legalization and development and the eventual hosting of the casino. And it really, again, sheds light on the power struggles between different interest groups. So business, political, union, labor leaders, and larger political and economic forces that then shape these struggles. And again, determined who got what in this sort of development. So here we have a picture of Windsor on the left, and you'll see the large building there. That's Casino Windsor, and it's by far the largest building in the city. And then we have the Detroit River and the Detroit skyline to your right. So at a high level, right, we're keeping it high level here. So casinos continue to be sold to communities, right, experiencing economic decline. However, this book somewhat problematizes the use of that. And Windsor's entrance into the casino economy or the casino industry is seemingly set on a path now to repeat Windsor's economic history, paradoxically, in that a similar dependence on another single large employer, it has reoccurred. There's a lot of worker immobility now, worker precarity, despite being also unionized by the CAW, the Canadian Auto Workers Union. So there was initial expectation that the casino itself would actually fuel more diversification. But in fact, again, it's really solidified the community's dependence on another large employer and primary dependence now to a casino. The short-sightedness of the heavy dependence on the casino also quickly came to fruition as the casino was the only one in the region, the Windsor Casino was the only one in the region for about 6 years. And then Detroit passed legislation, or Michigan, and they ended up putting 3 casinos that line the US-Canada border, Windsor-Detroit border. So with that, we have really intensified interlocal competition for largely local dollars, okay? It's not an international casino. And with that, the precarity that casino workers now experience relative to auto workers is more extreme, as Casino Windsor now competes with 3 resort casinos in Detroit for localized dollars in comparison to the more national and international orientation of the auto industry. And finally, here we have a picture of Casino Windsor taken from the Detroit River, and which was rebranded as Caesars Windsor in 2008 in an effort to become more competitive in the regional market against primarily the 3 Michigan casinos. So looking beyond this case, it would be of interest to understand how the economic benefits of casino developments are distributed in host communities that have more leverage to negotiate their interests vis-a-vis corporation, the state, and also where workers and unions also have more leverage to pursue their interests. And perhaps in these circumstances, we could see that perhaps there are more economic benefits for the host communities. And more broadly, this book really bolsters the case for studying other mega project developments in deindustrialized cities to cope with. So what are they doing to redevelop? One could, Amazon warehouses, for instance. And how do the power struggles over resources amongst cities, corporations, the state, workers, and unions intersect again to determine who gets what? So getting around that inevitability of these projects equal this, but in this particular context, how's it playing out? So going forward, we can really challenge how things become unequal, so to speak. So thank you very much.
Well, that was great and raises all kinds of sort of research that needs to be done, right? Thinking about, the shift to event cities for a lot of places or mega projects. I'm curious how, whether casinos are a thing in Europe in the same way as North America. Certainly it's central, I think, to a lot of, North American jurisdictions. And so, yeah, very, very interesting. Next up, we have Ben Rogeley, who teaches geography at the University of Sussex in the UK. He's a practitioner of oral history. 2 of his books are based on long-term residential fieldwork in small English cities. One book was called Moving Histories of Class and Community, Identity, Place, and Belonging in Contemporary England, which is a great book. But the book he's going to be talking about today is Stories from a Migrant City, Living and Working Together in the Shadow of Brexit, which was published in 2020 by Manchester University Press. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and also to Lauren and the rest of the team for the invitation to be part of this wonderful event. I'm going to speak today about Stories from a Migrant City, Living and Working Together in the Shadow of Brexit. The book draws on 8 years of research in the small English city of Peterborough and the stories of over 100 residents, mostly recorded through biographical oral history interviews. Peterborough, about 90 miles due north from London, has a current population of around 200,000 people, had a strong manufacturing sector until the 1980s, and was known in particular for the manufacture of industrial and agricultural machinery, the latter not unrelated to its historical role as a market town, serving a large productive farming hinterland, including the fens to the east and south. It had also been a centre for railway work, being not only a major stop on the London-Edinburgh East Coast Main Line, but also a crucial junction between that line and the route between the east coast of England on the one hand and the Midlands and northwest of England on the other. Peterborough was also an important centre for the production of bricks. Nevertheless, deindustrialization, when it came, did not mean the devastating closure of a single large plant, as might have been the case in, say, a steel town. It did mean a switch from manufacturing towards services, including commercial office-based enterprises like insurance and publishing companies. Peterborough also became the headquarters for the travel company Thomas Cook, and was badly affected when that company went into liquidation 2 years ago, with over 1,000 job losses in the city. Employment services has long been an important business in Peterborough, with local gangmasters or labour contractors recruiting and transporting seasonal and other temporary workers for agricultural work, giving way more recently to larger employment agencies that continue to connect people seeking work with short-term jobs, not only in food production, but in the packing, processing, and distribution of food as well. Beyond food, the logistics and distribution industry became an increasingly important source of temporary work in the 2010s, following decisions by the City Council to allow the development of large warehouse distribution centres on the outskirts of the city. This played to Peterborough's locational advantages and its excellent road and rail links. Tim Strangleman mentioned in a comment to the Part 1 panel that case studies of individual places could be useful to deindustrialization studies, partly because they help distinguish between places where the state has played a significant role in ameliorating deindustrialization's effects from other places where the state had not done that. Peterborough was a part of the UK government's new and extended towns programme from the late 1960s until the Peterborough Development Corporation, set up under that programme, was closed down by Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. During its lifetime, the Development Corporation was a massive source of dynamism in the city, such that in spite of the decline in manufacturing, overall output and employment growth were high in the 1970s and 1980s. However, as my book shows, the Development Corporation was contested by existing residents who suffered compulsory purchase of their properties or had to service the allocation of newly built homes to incomers from London and elsewhere when they themselves did not have the opportunity to rent or purchase one. The theme of in-migration is central to the book. The oral history narrators explore people's moves from and ongoing connections to places beyond Peterborough, both within the UK and further afield. The book engages with Doreen Massey's concept of place as open, porous, and dynamic. I focus on two key questions from Massey. What does this place stand for? And to whom does this place belong? The answers are, of course, deeply contested, both locally and nationally, and the book shows how contestations at these different scales are linked. For example, many European Union nationals migrated to work in the city in the 2000s and 2010s, following the expansion of the EU. Struggles over political, social, and economic citizenship in the city continued alongside broader national debates about the rights and status of EU nationals in the UK, before, during, and after the Brexit referendum. That referendum was won in Peterborough by the Leave side, with a majority of approximately 60 to 40%. Like Mike McInwaite's excellent book on Burnley Road, Stories from a Migrant City pushes back against the notion of a left-behind indigenous white working class. I stress that the idea of indigeneity is nonsense in a context of multiple migration histories, and also emphasize that Peterborough's working class is multiracial, multi-ethnic, multinational, multilingual, and multi-status in terms of immigration status. Peterborough cannot be pigeonholed into a particular type of place. For example, 1 year after voting Leave, the city elected a Black woman, Fiona Onasanya, as a Labour MP, taking the seat from the Conservatives. The book complicates simplistic stories about the strengthening of English nationalism and continual move to the right. In particular, I take issue with the idea that it is only metropolitan liberals, a group sometimes portrayed as a cosmopolitan elite, which is at ease with ethnic difference and the presence of recent international migrants. Instead, I propose the concept of non-elite cosmopolitanism, showing this to be present alongside and in relation to historic and contemporary racisms, importantly including the legacies of British colonialism. As examples of non-elite cosmopolitanism, I show how workers oppressed by warehouses using management through algorithms sometimes came together across differences of ethnicity, nationality, and language to contest and resist overbearing management, callous approaches to health and safety, and tightening digital surveillance. Alongside this, the book contains examples of people coming together outside work too, offering lifts to colleagues, forming film clubs, and inviting each other to parties in community rooms. The book thus illustrates practices of resistance to racial capitalism and glimmers of hope, perhaps, that through connecting with each other's stories, we can better see each other's humanity and thus increase the chance of planetary solidarity in the face of existential threats, including climate change. Thank you.
I could see a lot of nodding heads during your presentation. I have a student there, Fred Burrill, and I haven't seen him nod so much in years, I think. So we did a field in labor history, and he destroyed every single work pretty much. So we should have had you on that list for labor history. But anyways, great work. So we're gonna end with Gabor Schering, who is a former member of the Hungarian Parliament from 2000 to 2010 to 2014, who is a Marie Curie Fellow at Bocconi University. His research addresses the political economic determinants of inequality in health and well-being, and how these inequalities shape the evolution of democracy and capitalist diversity. His book, The Retreat of Liberal Democracy, which was published by Palgrave in 2020, shows how working class dislocation and business elite polarization enabled illiberalism in Hungary, which of course is an urgent and pressing issue. Gabor, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and it's great to be part of this group of researchers doing great work on deindustrialization. My work, as said, is about Hungary, in particular, how Hungary went from a previously thought successful experimental case of how to combine neoliberalism with liberal democracy to a laboratory of illiberalism. So it's a story of this guy, how very often this story is told, how this guy single-handedly turned history on its head. But what I want to focus on instead in this presentation and also in the book is how another important political actor, namely the Hungarian left, has collapsed. Before Viktor Orbán's breakthrough in 2010, ex-socialist industrial towns were the rural strongholds of the left in Hungary, as in many other cases in Europe, but in in the US as well. But if you look at the map a few years later, what you can see is basically a total wipeout of the left from every single rural constituency except from the capital. So today you have a very cosmopolitan left, and there is no left remaining in industrial rural towns in Hungary. And my idea was that deindustrialization and the way the left has embraced neoliberalism has a lot to do with this. My book challenges two dominant arguments about the rise of illiberalism in Hungary. One is about political rogues, Viktor Orbán, but you can extend this to other cases in Western Europe or Trumpism, and it zooms in on the supply of illiberalism. And the other argument that I'm challenging is basically a similar challenge as Ben was formulating, which is trying to write off workers as suffering from this dysfunctional working class culture backlash. In Eastern Europe, you hear very often about servant mentality, that workers are just not ready for democracy. They are born undemocratic and anti-liberal. So as myself, I was born in a working class family. My father worked as an electrotechnician, and my mother was an industrial crane operator when they met. And I was very much dissatisfied with this dominant narrative. I thought that it cannot be that it was just one guy who just suddenly destroyed democracy in Hungary. And it also cannot be that this working class culture that I was sort of familiar with can be blamed for this. In fact, in the book, I argue that we need to shift the focus from political rogues and dysfunctional culture to the local consequences of mismanaged dependent development, foregrounding the rise of illiberalism among the working class casualties of deindustrialization and the national bourgeoisie peripheralized by transnational investors, identifying Orbán's regime as an accumulative state that rests on a new illiberal class compromise with national and transnational capital. So as you can see, deindustrialization is one part of the story that I develop in the book. And I'm stressing the role of businesses in particular, you know, which is very often neglected in the story of populism, authoritarian populism. And Hungary's case is just such a powerful case of showing how they play a crucial role in sustaining Hungary's illiberal regime. But in the next remaining few slides, I want to zoom in on the working class. So one story that I refer to in the book, and this is more the other aspects of my research, but my book is also referring to this, which is basically the post-socialist mortality crisis. You know, we have to really understand, to begin with, the real suffering that was going on in the lives of workers as Hungary transitioned from socialism to capitalism, to understand the roots of illiberalism in the country. And all over Eastern Europe, more than 7 million people died during the 90s. And as you can see on this graph, life expectancy declined significantly also in Hungary. Also, of course, Russia was the worst case, but in Hungary as well. And in one of my research, I collected quantitative data on deindustrializing towns in the country, in 52 towns. And I show that deindustrialization was indeed significantly and robustly associated with increased death rates in Hungary. And this resonates the experience of the deaths of despair epidemic hitting towns in North America's Rust Belt. This is a very similar story, and I developed this in other articles, not necessarily in the book. But this is so important to understand the lived experience of neoliberalism in the 90s, also embedded as this kind of health mortality crisis. And to understand the lived experience of transition in more detail, I also conducted 82 interviews with workers in Hungary's Rust Belt. These are the 4 towns where I did these interviews. All of these used to be strongholds also of the left, and now they are all, with the exception of one, solidly leaning right in Hungary. So one very important aspect is, again, going back to health, is that workers connect their health to the neoliberal economic transition in many ways. So you cannot just think of health as an outcome of individual decisions. It's so tightly interwoven with the fate of labor markets, with the fate of companies. And I thought it was so important the way Chiara described these companies as social institutions. They not only provided jobs and secure incomes, but they functioned as a kind of second home and family. They provided identity, they provided local services, they provided communities, all kinds of things that contributed to social cohesion. They take out these companies, people not only lose their incomes, but it's a whole devastation of local social fields and local social fabric that has effect on people's health. And you would think that this kind of experience with the neoliberal transition and the industrialization would be a fertile ground for left-wing politics. But no, it was not. And the reason is that it was not just an implementation of neoliberal policies, but along the implementation of those policies, there was a total disintegration of institutions and culture that sustained the working class, also the political institutions of the working class. Trade unions got much weaker, and the left itself gradually lost its embeddedness in these local constituencies by a total degradation of their organizational, on-the-ground organizational structures. They could maintain their support until the early 2000s, but then again, in the second half of the 2000s, a renewed financial crisis before the global financial crisis started to take place in many of the towns of Hungary. So this is when the left totally collapsed finally. And in the lack of a kind of a progressive social democratic discourse and identity, workers I found in interviews were not really referring to their experience as an experience of a class. They referred it as an experience of a nation. So when they think in terms of community, the only we that they think of, they have the language to think of, the legitimate language to think of is the nation. So it's the nation that was suffering. And it's also further strengthened by this experience of being colonized, so to speak, colonized by Western capital, Western transnational corporations. So although it's a kind of a left-wing critique that they present in their discourses, it ends up a discourse that reifies the concept of the nation. And of course, this represents a huge opportunity for illiberal entrepreneurs to exploit this. And this is what Viktor Orbán has done. So this is one aspect of my book. And in my book, I go on to show that although Viktor Orbán relied on this working class revolt against post-socialist neoliberalism, workers are not really the winners of the regime. And this is because the business class is an even more important part of the illiberal social class coalition that Viktor Orbán has put together. So he's basically duping the workers and trying to maintain at least partial support among workers through all kinds of nationalist discourses. So these are some of the topics that my book analyzes, and some of the articles that I wrote recently elaborate further on some of these aspects. Thank you very much again for this opportunity to present.